The faint light of morning slid through the half-open blinds, laying thin strips of gold across the floor. I stirred under the weight of the quiet, feeling the coolness of the sheets where warmth should have been. Somewhere in the house, I could hear a soft clink, the muted tap of ceramic against countertop. For a moment, I thought it might just be the neighbor moving around, but then I realized it was coming from my own kitchen. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and the air felt still, like the day hadn't quite woken up yet. Passing the hallway, I noticed Caleb's door wasn't fully shut. The sliver of light spilling out was unusual. He usually kept that door closed until he was ready to face the world. I slowed my step, glancing in as I passed. The bed was neatly made, the blanket pulled tight like he'd been up for hours. In the kitchen, Caleb stood barefoot on the cool tile, shirtless, his hair a disheveled mess that somehow looked intentional. He was making coffee, using my favorite mug, the old navy blue one with the chipped handle. The smell drifted through the air, warm and comforting, mixed with the faint hum he was giving to an old song I hadn't heard in years. It was one I used to play on Saturday mornings when he was a kid, back when pancakes and cartoons were all that mattered. He glanced up when he heard me, a faint, slow smile spreading across his face. "Morning," he said, as if he'd been waiting. "You're up early," I replied, leaning against the doorway. I tried to make it sound casual, but something in the moment felt different, like the air between us had thickened. He poured the coffee and handed me the mug, fingers brushing mine. It was such a small contact, but my hand tingled as I wrapped it around the ceramic. His gaze lingered for half a second longer than it should have, then he turned back to the counter. "You still like it black?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, taking a sip. "Still can't start the day without it." The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I watched him move, noticed the way his shoulders had filled out, the casual confidence in his posture. There was a familiarity in it, an echo of myself at his age, that made me pause. We sat down at the table, steam curling up from our mugs. For a while, neither of us spoke. His eyes seemed to study me, almost like he was searching for something in my face. My mind flickered back to the months before, when he'd shown up at my door after the breakup. He'd been quiet then, withdrawn, spending nights locked in his room or lying on the couch with the TV off, staring into the dark. One night, I'd sat beside him, put my hand on his shoulder, and told him he'd get through it. He'd leaned into me, just slightly, and I'd felt that silent, unspoken trust. The scrape of the front door broke the moment. Tyler stepped in without knocking, grinning like always. "Borrowing that book, remember?" he said, pulling me into a hug before I could answer. Caleb's eyes shifted toward us, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Caleb," Tyler said with a nod. Caleb gave him a polite smile. "Morning." As Tyler turned to leave, he chuckled. "Jealous sons, man, they'll guard you like gold." He winked, and Caleb's jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. After Tyler left, the room felt quieter, but not in a comfortable way. Caleb leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest. His gaze kept flicking up to mine, then away. "You two always that close?" he asked casually. I raised an eyebrow. "Tyler?" "Yeah, we've been friends for years." He nodded but didn't say anything else, tracing the rim of his mug with his finger. We went back to silence, but it wasn't empty. There was something layered beneath it, something that made me overly aware of every shift, every glance. I took another sip of coffee, only to realize his foot had brushed against mine under the table. I expected him to pull back immediately, but he didn't. It stayed there, the lightest pressure, enough to send my pulse quickening. I looked up at him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. His expression didn't change, but there was a softness in his eyes, something that felt deliberate. I set my mug down, suddenly aware of how loud the ticking clock sounded in the stillness. He leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze locked on me. I tried to clear my throat, to think of something to say that would break the strange tension building between us. Before I could, he smiled faintly, almost like he knew exactly what I was thinking. The sunlight had shifted, stretching across the table, catching the side of his face. And in that quiet, with nothing but the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of a car passing outside, I felt the moment tilt into something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore. That night, the rain came in steady waves, pattering against the windows and filling the house with a muffled rhythm. The storm outside seemed to pull the world in tighter, every sound from within the walls louder, closer. I had been reading in bed, trying to ignore the flickering of the lights as the wind rattled the trees, when I heard the faint creak of the floor in the hallway. A gentle knock came at the door before it opened just enough for Caleb's face to appear. His hair was messy, shadows of the storm playing across his features. "Can't sleep," he said simply, stepping in without waiting for an answer. He sat down at the foot of the bed, his knees brushing mine through the blanket. "The thunder's too loud," he added with a half-smile, as if he knew how much lighter that explanation sounded compared to whatever was actually in his eyes. We talked about nothing at first, about the storm, about the old oak in the backyard swaying against the wind. Then the conversation shifted. Caleb leaned back on his hands, his gaze drifting toward me. "Did you ever think about dating men?" The question was casual in tone but loaded in its delivery. I hesitated, my book forgotten in my lap. "I've thought about it," I admitted, "but never acted on it." He gave a faint, almost knowing smile. "Guess some thoughts don't just go away." The candle on my nightstand was the only source of light, its flame bending with each draft that slipped through the old window. The flicker painted his face in warm gold, his eyes catching the glow. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing against my knee through the blanket, not a passing touch, but one that lingered just long enough to make my pulse quicken. Before I could react, my phone buzzed. Tyler's name lit up the screen. I answered, and his voice was light, teasing. "You two living like newlyweds in that house," he joked. My eyes flicked to Caleb, who was leaning against the doorframe now, listening. A small smirk tugged at his lips, but he said nothing. After I hung up, the room felt smaller. Caleb returned to the bed, this time closer. He spoke softly, about how strange it was to be back home, how the quiet was both comforting and unsettling. I listened, caught somewhere between wanting to guide the conversation to safer ground and wanting to see where it might go. When the thunder cracked loud enough to make the windows tremble, he moved closer instinctively. Without thinking, I put an arm around him, and he leaned into it, his weight warm against me. We stayed like that for a long moment. His breathing slowed, and I thought he might fall asleep, but then he lifted his head slightly. His hug goodnight lasted longer than any hug should. His cheek pressed against mine, his hand resting lightly at my back. I could feel the warmth of his breath near my neck before he stepped away. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me in the dark with the sound of the rain and my own thoughts. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning the current that seemed to be pulling us both into a space neither of us had named. This was my son, but he wasn't the boy who used to follow me around in the backyard with a toy baseball glove. He was a man now, with his own mind, his own intentions, and in the quiet of the night, those intentions had felt dangerously close. The storm eased toward dawn, the rain thinning into a soft drizzle. My eyes were heavy when I finally closed them, if only for a while. But when I woke again, the light was already spilling into the room, and Caleb was sitting there, in the chair by my bed, watching me with a calm I couldn't quite read. "I wanted to see you wake up," he said softly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The sunlight poured through the blinds in narrow strips, painting the room in alternating bands of gold and shadow. For a moment, I didn't move. Caleb's hand was resting lightly on my arm, like it had been there for a while, as if he'd been tracing the lines of my skin in his mind long before I woke. The warmth of it spread through me in a way I couldn't ignore. "Morning," I murmured, my voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," he replied, his tone softer than I'd ever heard it. He didn't pull his hand away. I pushed myself up slowly, searching his face. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out low, not demanding, but heavy. His eyes didn't flinch. "Because you're the only person who's ever made me feel safe," he said. "And the only person who's ever really seen me." The way he spoke it, like a confession and a truth he'd carried for years, lodged somewhere deep in my chest. Before I could respond, the sound of tires crunching on the driveway broke the silence. Tyler's familiar knock followed. I opened the door to him leaning against the frame, sunglasses perched on his head. He stepped inside with that easy grin, but his eyes darted between Caleb and me, catching something in the air. We chatted for a while, but his gaze kept flicking back to Caleb, who stayed leaning against the wall, quiet, watching. When Tyler finally left, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "You don't owe the world an explanation. Just be honest with yourself." Later, Caleb and I sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun dipping low, throwing warm light over everything. There was distance between us now, a physical gap neither of us closed, but the words that passed between us were stripped bare. "I know this isn't normal," Caleb said, staring at the street. "But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel." I swallowed, staring at the coffee mug in my hands. "And I can't pretend I don't know it's there." For a long while, we just listened to the hum of the cicadas, the occasional car passing. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started up. Life kept moving, but I felt like we were standing on the edge of something unspoken, a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. When the evening came, Caleb said he was going to stay at a friend's for the weekend. I watched him pack a small bag, watched him move through the house like it was his and yet not entirely his anymore. As he stepped out the door, he paused. "See you Sunday," he said, giving me a look I couldn't read, one that carried both guilt and something warmer. Then he was gone, his car pulling away, the taillights vanishing down the street. I sat there a long time after, the porch light flickering on automatically as the sky darkened. Inside, the coffee mug still sat on the table from that morning, a faint ring at the bottom. The bedroom door upstairs was half open, the space beyond it shadowed and still. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed, but sometimes they cross you. The thought stayed with me as I locked up for the night, unsure if the weight in my chest was regret or the quiet, dangerous comfort of being seen.